I'll continue reading Mein Kampf. During the read before my previous read, Hitler was berating social democracy, berating Gallomania, the over glorification of French people. But suddenly, during my last read, he once again meandered and jumped to another topic. He went back to the Jew people. He went back to berate and vilify the Jewish people for no reason. Basically, he said, "Oh, the kaftan they were wearing, and the Jewish people were pompous." And he tried to read some book regarding the Jewish people, anti-Semitic pamphlets, but he couldn't really understand. And then he realized the Jewish people, although on surface there was a movement called Zionism, and there seemed to be a split, a division between among Jewish people itself. There seemed to be a split of faction between the people in Zionism and also the normal Judaism people. But however, Hitler thought and realized that the apparent split was illusory. Deep down, Jewish people were highly united, and of course, also Hitler couldn't stand the huge number of literature, theater, art were all created to laud the Jewish people, Judaism. He couldn't understand why 99% of all art, literature, theater were created to extol and adulate that 1% of people. I'll continue reading. Thousands of details that I had scarcely noticed before seemed to me now to deserve attention. I began to grasp and understand things which I had formerly looked at in a different light. I saw the liberal policy of that press in another light, its dignified tone in replying to the attacks of its adversaries, and its dead silence in other cases now became clear to me as part of a cunning and despicable way of deceiving the readers. Its brilliant theatrical criticisms always praised the Jewish authors, and its averse and criticism was reserved exclusively for the Germans. The light pinpricks against William II showed the persistency of its policy, just as did its systematic commendation of French culture and civilization. The subject matter of the feuilletons was trivial and often pornographic. The language of this press as a whole had the accent of a foreign people. The general tone was openly derogatory to the Germans, and this must have been definitely intentional. What were the interests that urged the Vienna press to adopt such a policy, or did it do so merely by chance? In attempting to find an answer to those questions, I gradually became more and more dubious. Then something happened which helped me to come to an early decision. I began to see through the meaning of a whole series of events that were taking place in other branches of Viennese life. All these were inspired by a general concept of manners and morals which was openly put into practice by a large section of Jews and could be established as attributable to them. Here again, the life which I observed on the streets taught me what evil really is. The part which the Jews played in the social phenomenon of prostitution, and more especially in the white slave traffic, could be studied here better than in any other West European city, with the possible exception of certain ports in southern France. Walking by night along the streets of the Leopold Stolt, almost at every turn, whether one wished it or not, one witnessed certain happenings of whose existence the Germans knew nothing until the war made it possible, and indeed inevitable for the soldiers to see such things on the Eastern Front. A cold shiver ran down my spine when I first ascertained that it was the same kind of cold-blooded, thick-skinned, and shameless Jew who showed his consummate skill in conducting that revolting exploitation of the dregs of the big city. Interesting. We have Hitler, the so-called most evil, uh, most cold-blooded person in the history, now alleging the Jews, as cold-blooded. I'll continue. Then I became fired with wrath. I had I had now no more hesitation about bringing the Jewish problem to light in all its details. No, henceforth I was determined to do so, but as I learned to track down the Jew in all different spheres of cultural and artistic life and in the various manifestations of this life everywhere, I suddenly came upon him in a position where I had least expected to find him. I now realized that the Jews were the leaders of social democracy. Oh, finally, um, Hitler amalgamate all the sporadic things he had been pontificating about. Finally, he united and linked the social democracy, which he hated a lot, together with Jews. I'll continue reading. In face of that revelation, the scales fell from my eyes. My long inner struggle was at an end. In my relations with my fellow workmen, I was often astonished to find how easily and often they changed their opinions on the same questions, sometimes within a few days and sometimes even within the course of a few hours. I found it difficult to understand how men who always had reasonable ideas when they spoke as individuals with one another suddenly lost this reasonableness the moment they acted in the mass. That phenomenon often tempted one almost to despair. I used to dispute with them for hours, and when I succeeded in bringing them to what I considered a reasonable way of thinking, I rejoiced at my success. But next day I would find that it had been all in vain. It was saddening to think I had to begin it all over again, like a pendulum in its eternal sway. They would fall back into their absurd opinions. I was able to understand their position fully. They were dissatisfied with their lot and cursed the fate which had hit them so hard. They hated their employers, whom they looked upon as the heartless administrators of their cruel destiny. Often they used abusive language against the public officials, whom they accused of having no sympathy with the situation of the working people. They made public protests against the cost of living and paraded through the streets in defense of their claims. At least, all this could be explained on reasonable grounds, but what was impossible to understand was the boundless hatred they expressed against their own fellow citizens. How they disparaged their own nation, mocked at its greatness, reviled its history, and dragged the names of its most illustrious men in the gutter. This hostility towards their own kith and kin, their own native land and home, was as irrational as it was incomprehensible. It was against nature. One could cure that malady temporarily, but only for some days or at least some weeks. But on meeting those whom one believed to have been converted, one found that they had become as they were before. That malady against nature held them once again in its clutches. I gradually discovered that the social democratic press was predominantly controlled by Jews, but I did not attach special importance to this circumstance, for the same state of affairs existed also in other newspapers. But there was one striking fact in this connection. It was that there was not a single newspaper with which Jews were connected that could be spoken of as national, in the meaning that my education and convictions attached to that word. I'm not too sure when Hitler said his fellow workmen complained a lot and did not show any patriotism towards their own nation. I'm not too sure whether those workmen were Jews. Actually, it seemed to be. I infer so. Let me continue. Making an effort to overcome my natural reluctance, I tried to read articles of this nature published in the Marxist press, but in doing so my aversion increased all the more, and then I set about learning something of the people who wrote and published this mischievous stuff. From the publisher downwards, all of them were Jews. I recalled to mind the names of the public leaders of Marxism, and then I realized that most of them belonged to the chosen race, the social democratic representatives in the imperial cabinet, as well as the secretaries of the trades unions and the street agitators. Everywhere the same sinister picture presented itself. I shall never forget the row of names: Austerlitz, David, Adler, Alan Bogan, and others. One fact became quite evident to me. It was that this alien race held in its hands the leadership of that social democratic party with whose minor representatives I had been disputing for months past. I was happy at last to know for certain that the Jew is not a German. Wow, this sentence seems to have really significant corollary. Finally, I know that the Jew is not German. This is what Hitler said. And maybe that begot his hostility and animosity towards the Jews. I'll continue. Thus I finally discovered who were the evil spirits leading our people astray. The sojourn in Vienna for 1 year had proved long enough to convince me that no worker is so rooted in his preconceived notions that he will not surrender them in face of better and clearer arguments and explanations. Gradually, I became an expert in the doctrine of the Marxists and used this knowledge as an instrument to drive home my own firm convictions. I was successful in nearly every case. The great masses can be rescued, but a lot of time and a large share of human patience must be devoted to such work. But the Jew can never be rescued from his fixed notions. It was then simple enough to attempt to show them the absurdity of their teaching. Within my small circle, I talked to them until my throat ached, and my voice grew hoarse. I believed that I could finally convince them of the danger inherent in the Marxist follies. But I only achieved the contrary result. It seemed to me that immediately the disastrous effects of the Marxist theory and its application in practice became evident, the stronger became their obstinacy. The more I debated with them, the more familiar I became with their argumentative tactics. At the outset, they counted upon the stupidity of their own opponents, but when they got so entangled that they could not find a way out, they played the trick of acting as innocent simpletons. Should they fail, in spite of their tricks of logic, they acted as if they could not understand the counter-arguments and bolted away to another field of discussion. They would lay down truisms and platitudes, and if you accepted this, then they were applied to other problems and matters of an essentially different nature from the original theme. If you faced them, okay, I will stop here. See you in another episode. Goodbye.